Okay, we'll get started right on time. Thanks everyone for joining us. If you are not speaking, please mute yourself. So we will be taking Q&A at the last 20 minutes of the session. But for now, we will not be doing Q&A. We will be doing the presentation. And let me start my screen sharing. So, oops. I'm screen sharing. Here we are. Can everyone see what I'm sharing? Yes, okay, cool. All right. All right, hi everyone. Welcome to TechBuzz China AI webinar. We have Jeff Ding with us today. I want to just give a really brief introduction to the agenda. So Jeff will be speaking for 40 minutes. He does have a presentation prepared, and then we'll be entering Q&A. When we do have Q&A, please type your questions in advance in the chat box, and then I will just call your name, and then you can unmute yourself and then say your question. So what is TechBuzz China for those of you that do know? Or those of you who don't know, we're unique insights and takeaways in China tech headline news that don't always make it into English language coverage. So we have a podcast, which you probably know us for, but we also actually have a newsletter, events like this one, and then trips, and then we're actually also working on books. So you can go find out more about us at techbuzzchina.com, and hopefully you signed up for our mailing list when you signed up for this program. If you want to be on our events, you can sign up for the mailing list or actually just go to our events page. We have 2 more coming up. Our next one is on China esports a week from now. It's not going to be in the morning. It's going to be in the evening, California time. And we try to rotate the time so that, because we have 3 time zones to cover, so we want to have, Asia and Europe participate as best as possible. So the session is being recorded. So if you have any questions, you want to come back to it, I will be sending out the YouTube link after the session. I will also be sending out a feedback form. So we'd love any feedback. And then here we are to the bulk of the meat of the session. It's my pleasure to introduce Jeff. I've actually never met Jeff in real life, just over Zoom, because most of the time he is in Oxford, actually, where he is now currently a PhD student, and he is at the Institute, at the Humanity Institute in the Department of AI. And he is one of my favorite people to follow on China AI. He runs the China AI newsletter, which I understand some of you are on, and that's where you discovered this event. I highly recommend you do go sign up for it if you haven't. It is mostly weekly, right? And Jeff has a lot of really interesting things to say. So the reason why we put together this webinar is just because there's so much discussion and about this topic, and I find that Jeff is just one of the most thoughtful thinkers about this, and we haven't had the opportunity to feature his work on the podcast, and we're actually recording this and we'll be editing this for a future podcast episode as well. But welcome, Jeff. You can now unmute yourself and share your screen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ray. I'm a fan of the TechBuzz China podcast. I like to kind of just put it on for a run. It's like a nice bite-sized 20-30 minute thing, and I like how they make it like really light and digestible, but also there's like a lot of information. So I was listening to the ByteDance one yesterday. So yeah, it's exciting to be here. Basically I'm flexible in terms of how we do this. I have a bunch of slides. The first 5 are just going to be about what I call unsexy China AI, and basically just looking at the companies that aren't often covered in the Western news media or aren't as flashy or visible consumer companies. And it also involves what's happening in cities outside of the first tier cities. So what's happening in cities outside of Beijing, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Shanghai. And then I have a bunch of other slides where I give like the standard kind of like 10 thoughts I have about China's AI development to like policymakers like in DC. And I can run through those really quickly, but I'm also open to just, if there's people with more specific questions, maybe throw them in the chat or something. Or if I'm going too fast, just tell me to like stop and clarify. I'm going to try to just like get as much information out there as possible. Cool. Let me pull up the screen share. Do you have the, should I pull up the slides on my screen, Ray? Okay. I think it's like an iron law of any presentation about technology. There has to be some technical difficulty, so bear with me here. Are you all seeing the slides by any chance? No?
I see them.
Oh, you do see them? Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Let's dive in then. So this is slightly blurry, but this is from a previous China AI translation. It's from a media platform called Leifeng. The English is Leifeng. It's one of the kind of the sites that I constantly follow. I subscribe to. It's one of the subscribed accounts on like the list of WeChat public accounts, and they regularly pump out information on China's tech scene, smart industry. I loosely call them the MIT Tech Review of China. I think Karen is on this call, and she actually works at MIT Tech Review, so she may disagree with that assessment, because I think MIT Tech Review actually has a China branch. But basically, they regularly pump out really high quality articles on China's AI scene, and they did like a ranking of kind of the best future AI companies, or the AI companies with the most growth potential, and you can see kind of a list of these companies. And it gives you a good sense of the diversity of the scene. So you have like the strong tech giants, like you see Huawei in kind of the row of AI security, and under the column of best fortified growth. So Huawei, tech giants are up there. There are branches of tech giants on there. You have kind of like the standard facial recognition, the big four facial recognition companies. So if you look at the AI and medicine row with the product growth vertical, you have E2's kind of precision medicine app. And then you have kind of other well-known startups that have been covered, like Squirrel AI. Momenta is a strong computer vision company in AI and cars and commercial growth. So some of these names are standard. Some of the names that stuck out, like CloudWalk, I covered in the recent issue of China AI. That's also one of the big four computer vision startups. Some of the names are less standard. So one that stood out to me was just UltraPower. I've never heard of them before. And they are one of the few that appear twice, right? The best in future growth, both in 2018 and 2019. Shenzhou Taiyue, I think is how you pronounce that. So why is this company interesting? Well, first of all, it's been around for 20 years. So it's one of these like long-standing companies. It probably has a lot of good relationships with the government. It's worked closely with China Mobile before in the past. I think they developed one of the first IM messaging apps. But what's more interesting about this company is it's doing something that's not gonna like make headlines. It's not like some cool face swapping app or like deep fake thing, but it's doing like a lot of the back-end enterprise processing, which is gonna be, I think, one of the big areas where AI is going to make increases on productivity. So stuff like building natural language processing, NLP banks, NLP factories for companies to like better streamline how they manage all their operations, how to kind of make smarter the processes behind software updates. Very like unsexy stuff, but just like coordinating everything that happens in a company better and more efficiently. So that is a lot of what UltraPower does. And I think like these types of companies, other ones that I've covered include like State Grid, which is a state-owned company, one of the biggest in China, and they actually are number one in terms of like the patents that they file in AI. Now, some of this is like inflated because there's different incentives for state-owned companies to file patents, but and I would still say like some of the more well-known startups probably have better technical capabilities, but something like State Grid is going to be at that kind of like second order, who is adopting and then specializing some of these more general AI algorithms for specific applications, like State Grid in terms of like flexible energy grid management. So yeah, I'm trying to go one by one through a lot of these companies and do like profiles of them each week. But it's a lot of companies, and we're trying to like crowdsource some of these initiatives. Yeah, if you're interested in exploring some of these, this is a good starting point. The other aspect of Unsexy AI is, I think like making knives better is really, really interesting. And I think it's it's a really key application of AI in China. Especially if you look at the July 2017 plan. This was part of my Deciphering China's AI Dream report. If you look at the language carefully, a lot of people, including myself, we had trouble translating this. I forget what the exact term was, but it was something that I translated as gross output. And that's a term that's very much like a manufacturing indicator. And there's a heavy emphasis on manufacturing, kind of like economic forces as the driving force behind this like plan. And it's very much rooted in this idea of like trying to escape the middle income track. And one of the key things here is a lot of times when you read Chinese writings on AI, they're not necessarily comparing themselves to the US as much as kind of US media is, where everything is wrapped up in like a US-China two-player game. And in this article from Jiqi Zhixing, which is a really good kind of pumping out a lot of good long-form articles on the tech scene from their sub-platform called Jiqi Zhinen. You can get like English readouts from from the platform Synced. They do like condensed translations of their work. But they had this long article on computer vision and machine quality inspection on production lines. And see the quote from the CEO of a small startup that's making this comparison, not between the China and US on these areas, but between Germany, South Korea, Switzerland, in terms of like making stuff like this knife better. Actually, like in this article, it says that in these production lines of just something as simple as making a knife, like 20 to 30% of the human capital is spent on just like inspecting the knife for defects as it goes through the production chain. And that's what Shu Zhilian comes in. It's basically just saying that can we apply computer vision to improve our ability to get China to a higher level of efficiency in manufacturing. And so that's a very clear example of where you're actually getting to productivity growth. I think that's important. We talk about facial recognition, but it's definitely important. It's going to be spread across a lot of verticals. But where is the actual impact on productivity growth, which is the key driver of long-term economic growth? So I think this sort of stuff is also really important. And last thing about kind of unsexy AI is, can we talk about things outside of the top 4 cities? And this was from another earlier translation, but basically they did a ranking of who are the top 5 cities in terms of demand for computing power. That's a good proxy for like who's running the most, training the most AI algorithms, who's doing inference on the most AI algorithms. And actually the 2 dark horses that they found were Hefei and Hangzhou, 2 non-first tier cities. And this draws from a report that I contributed to recently by Nesta, where I looked at these 2 AI ecosystems. And the key part of both of these cities is they have a key anchor tenant tech company. For Hefei, that's iFlyTech. For Hangzhou, that's obviously Alibaba. And then they also each have an elite university that glue the ecosystem together. For Hefei, that's University of Science and Technology of China, USTC, and for Hangzhou, that is Zhejiang University. And I think both of those are top 10 universities, kind of like top tier universities. And in each of these cities, there have been consistent local level, provincial level funds to support AI development. For Hefei, they've strategically targeted speech recognition because they're just not going to draw like the global talent that's needed for a comprehensive AI ecosystem. For Hangzhou, they've been able to kind of diversify in a lot of areas, because they have more extra regional linkages, and they also are able to attract global talent. Just because it's a better place to live in, higher living standards, etc. But yeah, I think these are. I think what's important here is, I think a lot of times we focus on like who's going to build the next Silicon Valley, which is important. And like we focus on like the Silicon Valleys of China, like Zhongguancun in Beijing. I think what's also important in a lot of these countries that are trying to like develop AI capabilities across the board, and if you think that technological diffusion is important, it's about how do you connect the Silicon Valleys to the Detroits of the world, or to the Iowa cities of the world, which is where I'm at right now, and how do you have clusters outside of the Silicon Valleys. So these are also developments that I think are interesting. Is everyone still with me here? I can't really see the chat or anything. Just, I don't know, just like feel free to chime in too if you have like a question or you want me to go more on some other point. Otherwise, I'll just keep like speeding along. Okay, so this is the start of kind of my standard presentation of like 10 key points that I talk about when I think about like China and AI governance more broadly. So number one is China is now and will remain an indispensable actor in AI governance. I use indispensable to reference Madeleine Albright's term about the US role in the world, which is just not the idea that like it consumes everything and that it has to be the policeman of every single sphere of governance, but without it, nothing can really happen. And I think that applies now to China as well. This is from Mary Meeker's most downloaded slide deck every year, where she looks at internet trends. And the top 20 worldwide internet leaders 5 years ago, you see only 2 Chinese companies. And then today, which I think is 2018, in the context of this slide, you have 9 Chinese companies as the top 20 worldwide internet leaders, whereas you just have 11, whereas the rest are US companies. And this is a imperfect but a good metric, because a lot of these companies also have AI labs, some of the best AI labs attached to them doing fundamental research in the space. And kind of one of the first areas where AI is applied relatively easily is through like internet data, consumer internet data, social networks, recommendation algorithms. So I think the argument is we can debate over like how far along China's AI capabilities are, but I think the reason why I stress that China will remain an indispensable actor is even if the capabilities aren't advanced, other countries will prop up Chinese AI capabilities to justify actions in the space. And I think this is an interesting kind of leaked memo about a centralized 5G network and kind of the reasonings behind that, why there's a push to centralize the US's 5G network was because they were fretting about China's dominance of artificial intelligence. So it's just that's kind of like a scene-setting case. But that falls onto my next point, which is that Western observers consistently overstate China's AI capabilities. This draws from a testimony last summer that I did for the US-China Commission, where my conclusion was basically China is not poised to overtake the US as an AI superpower. And I think that oftentimes when we try to measure national AI capabilities, we just don't have a good sense of what we're trying to measure. And it obviously matters for different things. If you're measuring AI capabilities for overall productivity growth, I would be measuring different things than if I were measuring national AI capabilities for who's going to have the most advanced weapon system to be able to apply like autonomous control, right? So then I would use different indicators. What I'm using here is just kind of very broad drivers. And I try to separate things out along 3 cross sections. One is like, what are your scientific and technological inputs, and what are your outputs? Some people think outputs are a better measure because you're actually seeing them translated into actual value. Some people say inputs are better because they say you can't capture all the outputs perfectly. So you might as well see like what's being put in terms of like how much talent are you investing in, how much R&D spending are you putting in, rather than what are your patent and publication counts. And a consistent finding around here is that while China leads in the raw counts, if you control for quality and like how much these publications and patents are cited and forward cited by other people, and if you control for quality, the U.S. is still pretty far ahead, and we're still uncertain about things like R&D spending. Another thing you have to divide things by is you have to look at different areas of the value chain. So actually, a lot of Chinese government documents complain about China's lack of foundational AI open source software. So I actually translated like a whole white paper that they did on this very subject, where they said 66% of AI open source software is developed in the United States, and they view that as like a key weakness. One of the reasons why fundamental AI open source software like TensorFlow, PyTorch is important is because once people get used to coding on these sort of languages, it makes them more likely that they want to work for these companies like Facebook and Google. They get more used to their products. They also like, it creates network effects because you get your code, kind of like free code fixes and suggestions. So these all have a cumulative effect. And then the other domains are like taking the basic open source software and specializing it for your specific application. And then lastly, an application like maybe like a smart speaker, or like kind of the end device that someone is selling. So we have to differentiate between those different layers. And then finally in different subdomains. So I think it's pretty clear that US is ahead in like one of the most valuable market areas that we know of, autonomous vehicles. I've talked a little bit about enterprise AI and like business processes. Military applications looked at like some researchers at RAND have done kind of a patent analysis of military applications. They found that in the past 15 years, the US has cumulatively 7 times more patent applications that reference like autonomous in their abstract. So, and then finally, I think there are some areas where China is ahead in some subdomains and in some aspects of the value chain. Facial recognition for surveillance is an obvious one, but also you have to make like clear distinctions in the space between like Chinese NLP and English NLP, right? The L in NLP makes a difference in terms of which companies have better capabilities. It's obvious that like because Chinese companies have more of a kind of a demand from Chinese consumers, they would specialize in Chinese NLP. Okay, number 3. China is not a monolithic actor, and this distinction is meaningful for key issues in AI governance. So maybe here, I just want to focus on the companies. There's a lot of like disagreements between bureaucratic departments too that I mentioned in my report, Deciphering China's AI Dream. One of the big ones is like MIIT, which is the Industry Information Technology Ministry, versus Ministry of Science and Technology over who does technology planning. In the Nesta piece, I talk about how like a lot of the outlays on AI planning are coming at the provincial and local government, and a lot of good analysis of People's Liberation Army has been done by Elsa Kanya and others, I think at CNES. So those are other important distinctions to make. But I want to focus in on the companies. So there's this concept of like the national team in AI, and a lot of framing of the national team, 国家队, has been around this outdated notion of national champions, where like governments are directly subsidizing companies or directly own the companies. Whereas a lot of these new national team companies are largely private multinational companies with international ambitions. They don't just want to compete in the Chinese market. But I think you have to make distinctions. So the first batch of national team companies was a batch of 4 companies. It was the BAT companies and iFlyTech. And iFlyTech is interesting in that of the first batch of national team companies, it was definitely the most national. They rely heavily on government subsidies. They were born out of, I believe, USTC, the university I mentioned earlier, and that is a university with very strong connections to the state. So, Yeah, I think like, why does this matter? Which company is more national? Well, with kind of the increase in techno-nationalism, the increase in um, ensuring data security, and tying the increasing linkage between technological issues and national security issues, I think that there is a trend towards, at least on the part of the Chinese government, wanting to um, indigenize innovation, maintain critical information infrastructure, um, within the scope of domestically invested companies. And you see some of those dynamics play out, as well, in terms of like which companies are invited to set technical standards in the space. And yeah, I think like there's a reason why SenseTime very quickly like moved one of their headquarters to Beijing, right? They're originally like a Hong Kong company, but I think there's a lot of incentives for SenseTime, one of the big facial recognition startups, to be a Chinese company. And you see these distinctions among even like the four computer vision startups now. So the recent issue of China AI focused on CloudWalk, which is one of the four. You have CloudWalk, E2, which we mentioned before, SenseTime, and Megvii. And this article made the argument that of all these four, CloudWalk is the most national. And they analyze this based off of like where they're getting their funding from. Are they getting their funding from state funds, or are they getting them from like overseas VCs? And CloudWalk is getting a lot of their funding from state funds, such as, I think there's like a Internet and Industry Innovation Fund. I forget the specific acronym, but that's like jointly invested in by the Ministry of Finance. So, and then also, where do you list, right? Megvii tried or was exploring listing on Hong Kong, which is kind of in the middle ground. Whereas there's rumors that like CloudWalk wants to list on this new Star Exchange, which is kind of like a science and technology specific market off of the Shanghai exchange that's trying to incentivize sort of like these companies to be supported by domestic investors. Yeah, I mentioned technical standards. I just like this example because it shows that like even Chinese companies that are supposedly more aligned with the state will also fight with each other. So technical standards has a lot of cross-cutting cleavages, and Chinese companies will often ally with their strategic partners, international companies, to vote against standards pushed by other Chinese companies, which was the case with this example of Lenovo and Huawei, where Lenovo voted against a Huawei proposal. Number four, China is not an impermeable national container, and this distinction is meaningful for key issues in AI governance. I like to give this example of Microsoft Research Asia. Microsoft Research Asia is one of the key kind of cultivation training grounds of China's AI scene. You have like 500 plus like key employees of different big tech companies, AI startups that spent time in Microsoft Research Asia. There's a famous ResNets paper. It's one of the key innovations, one of the fundamental advances in AI. It was used in, I believe, AlphaGo as well. It's a way to just like layer a bunch of neural networks together. And the four co-authors on paper, Microsoft Research Asia paper, but it's interesting to see where the four co-authors end up, right? So the lead, one of the co-authors, Kai-Ming He, he's now one of the lead developers at Facebook AI. So this is like a very techno-global example, right? Global flow of talent, a lot of talented Chinese AI researchers who work at Microsoft Research Asia eventually help Microsoft or help Facebook or come and like work for Snapchat. But also, three of the others went and started their own computer vision startups, Momenta, Megvii, Face++. We've mentioned some of these companies before. Hopefully some of the threads are tying together here. Also mentioned this point before, so I won't belabor it. Provincial and local governments will play an outsized role in implementing AI. And this is the case with overall innovation policy. If you look at like actual outlays of R&D spending, the majority is coming from local and provincial governments, not from the central government. So the implementation is also all happening at the local level, and this proportion is only rising. And yeah, so this goes back to the unsexy AI point of what can we look at? Can we look at local AI ecosystems outside of the top tier cities? And digging deeper into the Hangzhou and Hefei case, you had China's Speech Valley, which was a industrial national, which was designated a national level AI industrial area all the way back in 2012. So this predates the 2017 plan by 5 years. So it's like this investment in AI did not start in July 2017 with the national plan. Our attention to it started back then. Hangzhou AI Town is another interesting one. One of the issues of this space is you never know like what's actually happening on the ground and whether funds that are announced are actually being spent. What's cool about Hangzhou AI Town is they actually have a website where I drew on for the Nestor report that I was mentioning, where they actually list, hey, here's all the subsidies we gave, and here's all the funding and the specific projects and which companies and how much funding we gave. And it's divided into like office expenses, research expenses, and then a key component is cloud computing expenses, right? Because that's important for like training and running AI algorithms. And that third vertical of cloud expenses was really interesting because the provider of all those cloud services, all except for like one project, was Alibaba. So it's very clearly just like a way for kind of Alibaba to anchor the system. But I think they added like one for like Tencent cloud computing, just to like make it wasn't all like Alibaba cloud services. But yeah, I think this stuff is where we have to get to, where we're actually like, we have to get even more detailed than this, but how do you actually get to the level of like a Hangzhou AI town and see what's actually being spent, and what those specific projects are happening on the ground. So the next 3 points are just on different drivers of AI development. One of these is hardware. Yeah, just to give you a sense of why hardware is strategic. So I've mentioned like training, the difference between training and inference multiple times. And different companies will supply different chips for training and inference. So SenseTime, for example, world's most valuable AI unicorn. Training comes from NVIDIA, a US company that designs GPUs. And then the inference, kind of the end device implementation, comes from Qualcomm, another US company, which is why you're seeing compute targeted as a strategic asset in some of these discussions now. But even the US is not completely independent in hardware, right? So I specified that NVIDIA is a chip design company. They have a partnership with TSMC to actually manufacture and fabricate the chips. And those are based in Taiwan. And that's based in Taiwan. So, and even that Global Foundries, that number 2 on that chart, which is described as a US company, that's like, I think, controlled by a UAE state investment fund. So you start to see some of these like complicated cross-cutting cleavages and linkages in the space. Talent is another key driver. There's a 3-part takeaway here, and I think it holds true, although I need to update the data, but the 3 parts are: part 1, while China's researchers are climbing the ranks of international AI competitions and conferences. B, they are still not publishing the best of the best fundamental AI research. C, though this could change given China's huge base of talent. So this is something I did with Micro Polo and Matt Sheehan and Joy Ma, and using a nice database called CS Rankings, where I think it's better than like citation counts because it's just looking at publication counts in top conference venues. So there's no like citation rigging that can happen. And it's just like, are your academics publishing in the top 3 conferences? And here's the trend from 2013 to 2017. You see a clear increase in some of these Chinese universities. The B subpoint to this is the best of the best fundamental AI research is still at US institutions largely. And this is looking at specifically NIPS, which has been renamed NeurIPS, and that is like the top level forum for a lot of the fundamental research. And you can see that a lot of the list is dominated by US companies, and the first Chinese entity that pops up is Tsinghua University at 22, I believe. But the C subpoint is that this could change given China's huge base of talent. So if you look at those NeurIPS papers that we just looked at, and you dig deeper into like one of the actual authors, because that data from the previous slide about affiliations was just scraped based off of just the affiliation of the paper authors. But then if you look at like where these authors went for undergrad, that kind of gives you a rough proxy of where they're from, or at the very least like if they went to undergrad in China, there may be more likelihood that they could eventually go back to China, or they have choice to like work in different places, to pretty vibrant AI ecosystems. So China does have this like larger base where this paper number 19 on ternary gradients to reduce communication distributed deep learning is coded in the data set before as a US as people who represent US AI talent. But again, this is a techno-global cross-cutting landscape, and this represents a lot of researchers who China views as part of their huge base. Cold War arms race analogies do not translate to US-China competition AI. I've talked to this about this a lot in recent newsletter issues, so I won't give my spiel now, but kind of like my year 2 in review was basically all talking about how like I think this meme of like I call it like a glorified dick measuring contest in terms of who gets technological dominance in AI. I don't know if I'm allowed to use that on your podcast, Roy, so hopefully there's no language requirement. But basically, like I think we have to talk about more things besides who has more AI between the US and China. There are other countries in the world that exist, and China obviously views this as not just a 2-player game. Talked about this, economic benefits are the primary driving force. That's my opinion. I think like general purpose technologies like AI historically have like the most fundamental impacts have come through the economic realm, and then eventually they may have shaped military affairs, and then eventually they also shaped social governance. But there's just so many different applications with the general purpose technology that the economic incentives are too great, and I think economic drivers are like if you look at that as the central driving force that helps you unlock a lot of different things. And then just lastly, there's a diverse range of substantive discussions of AI ethics and safety in China. Those topics are off limits. I'm borrowing this concept from, I'm not sure, I think it's Sam Sachs or other people smarter than me have come up with this idea of like green light, yellow light, red light, and applied in the AI ethics space. There's a large diversity of discussions about privacy. Nandu Personal Information Protection Research Center is one of the key institutions I draw on, and I try to translate and read a lot of their work. They recently released a survey in December 2019 that showed that more than 73% of the Chinese respondents would prefer alternatives to sharing their facial data, and 83% want a way to access or delete the data. A lot of like data leaks have inspired a lot of conversations about privacy as well. In the yellow zone, there's even been I've even translated some discussions of misuse of facial recognition by the government, not just misuse of facial recognition by companies. That's a key distinction. And it's not like a very targeted critique, but it's from a professor that is obviously not the norm. She's relatively outspoken, and kind of because of her position may feel more comfortable speaking out, but she has explicitly called out misuse of facial recognition by the government, specifically with like the Beijing metro system. And then there's the red light issues, like disproportionate targeting of ethnic minorities across China, not just in Xinjiang, as some New York Times reporting has reported, but especially in Xinjiang, using AI-enabled surveillance. I have not found, unsurprisingly, I have not found much of like a robust civil society discussion about these issues. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks for bearing with me on that. And yeah, looking forward to the discussion.
All right, okay, thanks for the presentation. Please put your questions in the chat room. I don't know if everyone knows how to use the chat function, but if not, let me get started on some of the questions that I have from your presentation that we had already previously discussed. So I think because you wanted to title this talk Unsexy AI, you did mention UltraPower. Are there any other unsexy AI companies that you think the rest of us could keep an eye out on?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think one of the things is I think a lot of the sexy AI companies are the companies that are producing the fundamental algorithms, right? The Googles, the Facebooks of the world, and the Chinese equivalents. And then the unsexy AI companies are the companies are going to have to take those very general models. So like OpenAI produces GPT-2, like one of the biggest language transformer models for natural language processing. How does a company like UltraPower take that huge step leap in NLP capabilities, which is a very general model? How did they take those ideas and specialize that model for their specific application domain, which is helping maybe companies have like automated assistants that help do like business operation processes, or like make sure that everybody has like their updates processed. So that's like the second layer of companies. So yeah, companies like UltraPower, I mentioned State Grid, and I think like a lot of people, a lot of the companies on that list there in the first slide are going to be examples of this. So yeah.
And we will make the presentation available. So, okay, I'm gonna go straight to audience questions because now we have a bunch. I think people didn't realize where to put the questions. So Joshua, you're first. Could you unmute yourself and ask your question for everyone to hear?
Thanks. I'm not, I follow Jeff and his newsletter, although I would not consider myself an AI expert in any sense. But my question is related to the quality and research of Chinese AI. And I wonder if there's any parallels to the quality and I don't know how well they can be applied internationally, with the concept that they are focusing only on the domestic market because it's large enough and healthy enough.
Yeah.
So that when they, you know, as compared to, let's say, American or Korean or whatever, that
Right.
they are focusing on a global market and thus their AI is better. And a follow-up to that would be, is that incentive for Chinese companies to be going out to be purchasing shares or even outright ownership over foreign companies so they can grab that international AI experience?
Yeah, definitely. I think you're hitting on a key point here. And I think this, I mean, a good way to see this trend is just to look at patent statistics. So you can't just count patents based off like the Chinese patent office. Oftentimes like the gold standards for patents is to have like a trilateral patent. And so that's if your patent is verified by the US patent office, the European one, and also the Japanese one. And that's a good sign that you're actually, if you're going for those types of patents, that you have global ambitions. So I do think some of the top tier companies with like sizable AI research labs do have global ambitions. I think past like Tech Buzz podcast episodes have talked a lot about ByteDance. That's Ray, you can feel free to jump in as well. I think like they clearly do have these global ambitions. And yeah, you're exactly right that another strategy is just to do acquisitions and foreign investment.
Yeah, we've done a lot of work on ByteDance, although their AI lab is very specific about not putting out papers and very focused on application. Okay, next question is from Gilbert. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, for the great talk. You, on one of the slides, you compared US and China in various AI subdomains, but what about manufacturing as a comparison? It seems like China has a lot of existing, of course, China is a manufacturing hub, and it seems like they would have outsized advantages in getting access to existing factories, data, and manufacturing at scale.
Yeah, this is a great question. And this goes back to, I think this is a buzzword, but I mean, like the industrial internet is a really important concept here. So the stats I'm going to give you here draw from previous issue number 90. It's a translation of Alibaba Research Institute deck on kind of the quality of China's digital economy. And actually, like in terms of high quality manufacturing and kind of like digitization of the industrial internet, China's industrial internet still trails the US. So you can look at this from a variety of indicators. 5% penetration of smart sensors versus 12% in the US, much lower adoption of cloud computing, fewer patents on smart analytics, lower penetration rates of industrial robots, fewer companies planning to build digital factories according to surveys. And yeah, if you're interested, that issue has a slide deck, and slide number 46 has also a cool comparison of the diffusion of major industrial software like ERP, SCM, CRM, PDM across a bunch of different verticals, and shows that China is still trailing in this space. So I think like this goes back into the larger point of like, if we're talking about like how these technologies actually diffuse and spread across different verticals beyond just the AI companies, you have to look at just overall digitization too.
I'm a little intimidated that you're citing specific slide numbers now from your presentations. Okay, you really know yourself. All right, I think the next one is Karen, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello. Hi, Jeff. So I had a question regarding the slide where you're talking about the diversity of privacy perspectives among Chinese consumers. And I was wondering if you've seen anything lately about the way that the pandemic might be affecting the concept of data privacy, either at the consumer level or in the way that the government is thinking about regulating it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't honestly followed it beyond the two issues translating Hu Yong's microblogs on the topic. So yeah, I think he probably, his views, which are very critical of kind of how the enforcement of some of the contact tracing seem very biased against people from Wuhan, and kind of just the kind of human flesh mob type phenomenons that happen in terms of like targeting people from Wuhan. But that might be an extreme view, and that's probably not representative of the norm. Yeah, I can tell you from like conversations of like US folks involved in like the contact tracing that a lot of people have updated their views in terms of like what the privacy versus saving lives trade-off is, in terms of like being willing to sacrifice more personal privacy.
Could I just ask you, for the sake of the rest of us who might not have read those two issues, just to quickly summarize what that was?
Yeah.
Sounds like it was just negative, but yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
I recommend them as a reader. I really like those two issues.
Yeah, so Hu Yong is a professor at Peking University's School of Journalism and Communication. Very well-known kind of blogger whose microblog has 800K plus followers. And like he wrote two essays where he argues that the infringement of privacy by public health surveillance was like shocking in the response to the coronavirus from Chinese authorities. So he's drawing from like reporting from like Southern Metropolis Daily that details how, for example, personal information of more than 7,000 people who returned home from Wuhan for the holidays was leaked. And so you have like cases of like freshman students at universities who go back to home for their holidays, and then they see like on their family's WeChat group that there's like a data sheet of all the people who came back to Ningbo from Wuhan, just out there in the public. And all their like personal information, their phone number, specific home address, train information is all leaked. So yeah, he uses cases like these to just argue that like this obviously like cannot be the norm in terms of a response to public health crises like this, and how do you like manage this trade-off between protecting personal information and implementing effective contact tracing.
Yeah, and I think that's a good example of what you cited earlier, that there are these discussions going on about privacy. It's not just the illusion that some people have that, oh, Chinese people don't care at all about their privacy and they just willingly give it for, I don't know, free WeChat or something. Okay, next question is from Anupam. If you can unmute yourself and ask your question so everyone could hear it, that would be great.
Hey, Jeff, great seeing you. A great talk, by the way, just fantastic. So I wanted to ask you about the regulatory aspects here. We've got a largely unregulated space historically. but there is regulation that's coming in, privacy regulation that's sort of modeled on the GDPR, cybersecurity regulation, et cetera. And there's also, I mean, on the consumer-facing AI side, it seems to me that China has actually raced ahead in application. That is, these companies that purport to be, offering financial, credit based on AI evaluations. Whether they're actually doing that or not, who knows? And in the United States, I think there'd be some more pressure on, on making sure that those have some validity, especially in the insurance context, which is a heavily regulated space. And, credit as well is regulated, not nearly to the extent that insurance is regulated. So I'm just wondering how you're seeing the regulatory side of this kind of playing out.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Good to see you again as well. I think the key effort in this space that's been getting a lot of attention is the personal information protection specification. So SamSex at DigiChina has done a lot of the best coverage on this. And the crucial question is the language, as you say, the language is as rhetorically kind of powerful as the GDPR, but where's the teeth and where's the enforcement? I've covered some of the cases of this. There was a case at the provincial level where they did a year-long investigation into people who were selling personal information on QQ chat groups, and they actually arrested and convicted people based on this new personal information standard. So you're seeing some enforcement of it. I don't know in the application to credit ratings or insurance space as well. I like to cover the boring, unsexy stuff. That might get a little bit too boring for me, even. I think tracking just general attitudes to privacy is important too. Just looking off of what Ray is talking about is Chinese people care about privacy, but we just the first step is to acknowledge Chinese people care about privacy, but then to go further, you have to understand can you actually compare the two countries? And some people have done cross-national surveys. Genyo Koska at I think German university has published surveys on cross-national attitudes towards facial recognition adoption. And it shows that Chinese consumers are more willing to trust the government with facial recognition and their privacy, but less likely to trust businesses than German and American counterparts. So getting to those finer grained distinctions is important.
Yeah. I was going to say anecdotally, that is definitely true of my friends. So they're always scared that JD is selling their information, but they're less concerned about other uses sometimes. Okay. Connor, can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, we should go back to Gilbert because I think you may have skipped Gilbert, but sorry about that. So yeah, I'm just wondering about the different data paradigms between, specifically the U.S. and China. I mean, you kind of touched on it, that there's definitely some regulatory stuff in the pipe, and I'm just wondering if there's anything specific that the U.S. is trying to avoid in thinking about these data policies. I know a lot has kind of been walked back on in Europe since they released their white paper a few months ago. I know they've been kind of hamstrung in some of their public health efforts by some of the principles they laid forth. So I'm just wondering how you see the U.S. approaching data broadly, I guess, in the coming years.
Yeah, I don't have a good sense of broad what U.S. grand strategy should be. One example where I have followed this issue is in aggregating healthcare data from a bunch of different hospitals, which is important for if you want to run large models. So I think there's pretty strict laws in the U.S. that prevent that from happening, and those don't exist in China. Or also maybe the scale of Chinese hospitals, you're able to just get a larger data set from just a single hospital. So oftentimes you'll see cross-country collaborations where University of California researchers will partner with this medical university in Guangzhou, and they'll work on a kind of a joint paper based off of that data. Presumably will help both sides. But yeah, that's that's my main contribution there.
Yeah, that's definitely what the example you just cited is actually, I think, a business model that some people are working on in the Valley. So, okay, well, we'll go back to Gilbert since you already asked the question, Gilbert. Let's get to Jeff first, and then we'll go back to Gilbert. So, Jeff, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Jeff. It's been very interesting. I'm curious that your overview of the Chinese companies that have been doing well, what the difference in quality is in the AI backend for some of these companies, and whether that creates the winners or losers versus the other parts of a product that create product market fit.
Yeah, I mean that's a really great question. And it's like a question that like I imagine like every investor or like person with a stake in these companies is trying to like answer. It's just like how much of it is from the better technology and how much of it is from like the management team, all the other different aspects. And this actually goes to like an important point in this space as to why like technical standard setting is so important, is because it gives you a way to actually adjudicate between different technological capabilities of different companies. So that's why in facial recognition, one of the key tests is the U.S. National Institute of Standards, NIST, NIST does a facial recognition vendor test, and like usually get like 100 plus companies, including Chinese companies, U.S. companies, French companies, to just submit their facial recognition algorithms and test them based off of like their accuracy, their speed, reliability. And that provides a way to judge like differences between technological capabilities. So actually in a lot of those tests, Chinese companies come out really far ahead, or come out in top ranks of a lot of these metrics. And they'll like brag about like, hey, we scored first on this challenge for the NIST for NIST's facial recognition vendor test. And you're seeing this kind of exactly what your question is pointing at. You're seeing this issue be one that the Chinese government is trying to tackle. So a lot of standardization pushes. One of the key components is how do you develop a better measurement system for evaluating which AI system for a particular vertical is work better for like biometric recognition. So hopefully we'll get more data on like which companies are actually performing better on these tests, if like some of these set up for these technical standards setting operations.
All right, Gilbert, we'll go back to you for the second question.
Yeah, I think we briefly touched on this.
Oh, okay.
What are some examples of companies or research labs, both in the US and China, collaborating with each other and successfully doing that, as opposed to this Cold War mindset?
Yeah, yeah, touched on this a little bit, but just to give a broader view, I mean that specific example was like I think UC Davis. I mean, in terms of like strategic alliances, just things like even like patent licensing, like Google and Tencent had a big deal in that space. But in terms of just the broader landscape, I've done like scientometrics, and I think others have done scientometrics where they're just tracking like co-citations, co-collaboration, co-authorship in the AI domain, and US and China have like the densest level of collaboration. For the broader science and technology relationship, like people have called like the US-China relationship in science and tech a special relationship, like, you know, the US-UK kind of like close-knit special relationship. Obviously that's starting to potentially fray, but I think there's just too many like structural factors that will kind of keep these sorts of collaborations sustainable.
And I just typed this in the chat, but Jeff has kindly agreed to stick around for you know, a few more minutes for more questions. But if you do have time, please fill out our feedback form, the URL of which I just pasted in the chat room. And now we'll go to I'm not sure how to say your name, so Fu Baby, if you can, or Fu Bobby, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question, that'd be great.
Yeah, hi, this is Fu. You can just call me Fu. Thanks. Great presentation, Jeff. I was going to ask you in terms of export markets. I think you had mentioned in one of the slides that some Chinese AI companies have global ambitions. Could you speak to if export markets such as actually frontier markets such as Africa or Latin America are in play for these Chinese AI companies, and if they are, which ones have you seen in your research?
Yeah. Yeah, this is an important topic. I think like one deal that comes to mind right away is the CloudWalk deal with Zimbabwe government. So that was covered a lot. That was covered a lot in the frame of like Zimbabwe is giving away their data to CloudWalk. And now there's been like follow up. I think reporters talked to some reporters about this where like apparently like Zimbabwe has come out and said that they're not actually giving away the data. But so that's one issue is like is our surveillance methods being exported to African governments. I think like the issue here is in a lot of discussions like China-Africa relations, oftentimes like from the US view, like we just like ignore the agency of African governments themselves to like make decisions on their own. So I don't know to what extent the Zimbabwe government will have like control over the data. But some of the motivation is not just to like for Chinese companies, it's not just to gain like new markets, but also to like diversify the database because their algorithms may like perform not as well on like darker shaded faces, which is a finding that like other researchers found in like tests of a bunch of like the state of the art algorithms. In terms of other countries, I would point you to reporting done by Yuan Yang and some others at Financial Times, where they recently looked at like how surveillance companies are looking at are trying to like export or kind of set standards in this body called the ITU in an effort to kind of like have their products basically be the functional standards for like smart surveillance, like lampposts. So like E2 has, or like ZTE has like a smart lamppost project that they're trying to push, I think, in a bunch of different African countries. And I think like one issue is like my kind of coverage of the space is also very much under just the surveillance vertical. So I wish I knew more about like what's happening in the other verticals because AI is going to affect everything. So yeah, if others have thoughts on that, feel free to jump in, but mostly on the surveillance vertical.
What are the smart lampposts for? Just curious.
I think this was a big deal in Hong Kong. I don't know if you remember like the Hong Kong protesters, they toppled a lamppost because they thought it was like a smart lamppost that contained like a camera that would like track people through facial recognition. So the idea is that it's different from just a regular CCTV camera in that the idea is like the smart lamppost would have, you could run the algorithm and like process the face at the end of the device rather than looping everything back to like a central processing system. So that like, I guess, enables some form of like real-time tracking.
All right. Okay. I don't see any more new questions in the chat. So I will ask one, maybe that everyone else here forgot to ask, which is, so Jeff, you mentioned you cited quite a few other researchers you follow, and especially like seminal papers, et cetera. But in general, for those of us who are interested in keeping an eye out on China AI, what should we be reading aside from subscribing to your excellent newsletter?
Yeah, I think the main thesis of kind of one of my main like points that I'm trying to push is just like, if you want to learn about China's AI landscape, imagine that you're someone in Germany that wants to learn about Silicon Valley. So what are you going to do? Are you going to read like the work from the 2 Der Spiegel reporters in Silicon Valley if they have like an outpost there? Yeah, you are. I mean, it's a great publication, and Der Spiegel might like cover angles that like the US publications that are covering Silicon Valley might not cover. So I'm definitely going to read all of them. So yeah, I'll read everything from New York Times, Financial Times, MIT Tech Review, like the best coverage on like China's AI scene. Read that. But if you're a German in Germany wanting to learn about Silicon Valley, you're going to read the English language publications, Bloomberg, all the MIT Tech Review. I'm going to read the English language publications about Silicon Valley. So if you're an American or someone else outside of China wanting to learn about China's AI ecosystem, yeah, read all the English language publications, but I would focus most of my time is focused on just reading the Chinese language publications. So obviously there are nuances to that approach. There are some topics that just don't get covered, like authoritarian societies are different from democratic ones. But at least on the tech scene, if you want to learn about companies and what's happening on the ground, there's so many of these publications. I cover some of them in my translations. DigiChina does some of the policy translations. Other newsletters are popping up to cover this. So like China Talk, run by Jordan Schneider, is doing like a broader like Chinese economy coverage, also using like translation approach. Corey Fitz is doing like the China AI model, but for like China's space industry. And Politico just launched like a new newsletter called China Watcher, which I think will also leverage a lot from like translations. Center for Security and Emerging Technology is doing a lot of translations on China and AI policy in general. So yeah, that would be my main encouragement. It's just like a information asymmetry. Like it's just what a rational person would do. Look at where like there's a shitload of really good information that nobody's reading and just mine it.
Yeah, well, thanks to efforts like yours and Jordan's, and actually we do basically a lot of that as well. If you look at our transcripts, we're primarily citing Chinese analysis. Okay, so but based on what you just said, right? Like a question I have is, what are some topics you think that aren't covered enough in the English language speaking side that you wish were covered more? That is it just the unsexy stuff?
Yeah, well, I think like another way to apply this is like look at where like all the dominant narratives are hurting people to go. So one dominant trajectory right now is to view everything that happens with respect to China's development through the lens of who's going to gain technological dominance, US or China, right? There was a great Bloomberg article this morning about how China's whole new infrastructure push, which is like a really important concept. New infrastructure, there's some real money behind it, but the headline is like China's new effort to steal the crown jewel of technology from the US. Whereas like there's a lot wrapped up in the new infrastructure push that's not about like competing with the US. There's a lot about like, is this a stimulus amid like COVID? Is this an effort to like protect critical information infrastructure? So just like look for things that go outside of the kind of like where the dominant trajectories are going. And I think that's like a way to like have like this idea of like information arbitrage that I've been trying to push.
Are you talking about, you're talking about the 1.4 trillion, whatever number that was thrown around?
I don't know the number, but yeah, the whole new infrastructure.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I read the headline. I hadn't read the article yet. All right, and I do want to ask, okay, Joshua does have one last question. I'll just ask it for you if you don't mind, Joshua. So Joshua's question is something I'm also personally interested in. So aside from throwing more government funding at AI research, right, what can the US do to remain far ahead of Chinese AI quality and effectiveness? Or is there?
Yeah, so I think like, one of the things is like the standard thing is just like throw a bunch of money at the problem. Usually it's like through like R&D. I don't know, I think like if you take like a more diffusion oriented approach, which is kind of what I'm pushing here, just like don't focus too much on the sexy AI aspects of like who's coming out with the most fundamental breakthroughs, but focus on like who's building the most connections between their like AI centers and like the smaller, the less sexy companies that are actually applying it across different verticals. Like how do you build those bridges? That often happens through like public-private partnerships. How do you help like promising startups get past the valley of death? I talk a lot about these in my like written testimony before the US-China Commission. So you can check that out for like more detailed analysis.
Yeah, maybe I can get the link from you and send it to the participants. Okay, yeah. I think that's it. And unless anyone has any more questions, we'll just end it here today. Thank you everyone for joining. Don't forget to sign up for Jeff's newsletter. It's China AI. Well, it's just one A, so CHINAI.substack.com. And it's free, it's great. You can definitely also donate and tip him for his excellent work, Guardian style. And of course, please subscribe to us. and sign up for our events and future webinars. I will be sending out a link of this recording, and then we'll see about presentation slides, etc. So I think that's it. Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.